I believe the world has truly gone mad. That's the only rational explanation for everything. And here in the States, we're listening to both sides of the political spectrum, from the deep states in a panic, from the bizarre behaviors of Rudy Giuliani. And I'm not sure my views of the deep state as the same manner as like the major networks, well, especially Fox might portray Donald Trump's enemies. I mean, I do believe there is a group with an agenda. But I think the Comeys, the Muellers, and the rest of them, they're only the pawns and only scratching the surface. Would you like to comment on the quote unquote deep state?
Yes, well, that's a very good point that you make, because deep state has only entered the mainstream political lexicon in the last year or two, as I'm sure everyone out there knows. But it has been around for quite a bit longer than that now. It's going back decades at this point, going to researchers like Peter Dale Scott, who pioneered the term and the idea when looking at, as he extensively has done in his writing, looking at, for example, the JFK assassination or 9/11. He talked about deep state and deep phenomena going on in the highest levels of government. And in that context, I think it's a very fleshed out and interesting idea. But in, of course, what becomes the McDonald's soundbite kind of style at which everything is just thrown at you on the 24/7 news cycle these days, the term deep state has been watered down to the point of almost meaninglessness at this point. I mean, it just refers to a few of the old guard, or some of the people who hang on through administration after administration. But it is, as you say, a much deeper, if you'll forgive the adjective there, a deeper phenomenon. It's a more important thing that's going on than just a few of these Muellers or people like that. Mueller. It's in fact, it's encapsulated in something that's going on this weekend that I imagine some of your audience might have heard about, which is the Bilderberg conference, which of course is taking place.
I was just going to ask you about that. Yes,
absolutely. Well, Turin, Italy, this weekend is going to be the scene of the. Let's do a quick calculation. It's going to be about this. Well, we're getting on to the 70th conference. I don't know if we're there yet, but at any rate, somewhere around there. And this year, they're going to be talking about populism in Europe. They're going to be talking about inequality. They're going to be talking about Russia. They're going to be talking about the post-truth world and other things, at least according to the official agenda. Believe it as far as you can throw it. But obviously, these are the things that preoccupy the minds of the people in the real deep state. And when we're talking about the real deep state, we're talking about more like the people who attend the Bilderberg conference, the CEOs of major international corporations, the heads of many foreign governments, very high-ranking officials, ex-CIA chief, people like Henry Kissinger. These types of people tend to be at least the super-gophers of whoever is really pulling the strings. And I'm not going to get into that. That's above my pay grade. But at any rate, there are people who are much higher up in the hierarchy, as the real hierarchy that exists, than these people that are kind of being thrown around as the deep state by the mainstream press these days. And I think it's unfortunate that this topic has become so diluted from its real meaning, because when you really look at it, there really is a driving force behind many of these major events that happen, but it's not the people that are being dangled in front of us in the puppet show that is politics.
Are the Bilderbergers, or is the true deep state, are they in panic? Are they comfortable with the scenarios that are going on here and around the world? Are they threatened?
Well, first of all, I would like to populism. I think that the premise of that question might be based on the idea of an all-powerful ruling oligarchy that can do everything and does everything, and everything that happens is their doing. And that is kind of the simplistic way that sometimes we think of it, even myself and others, when we just kind of gloss over it. Yeah, the deep state, they control everything. I think it's much more that there are competing power structures and competing elements within the deep state. Maybe we can't say the deep state, because maybe there are multiple deep states and they overlap in different ways. G. Edward Griffin gave a presentation that I always recommend to people, where he was talking about the concept of rings within rings, that there are these vast rings of people who are associated in different groups and connections and conferences and things that may or may not have any idea of what the ring of people kind of closer into the center of power are doing. And those people might not know what's going on a little bit closer into the center of power. So I think there are overlapping and interlocking systems of control, and they compete with each other. So I'm not sure there is a singular agenda and there is a singular response to what's happening right now, that the deep state is panicking per se. I think that, again, might simplify it too much to the point where it's diluted. But so taking it from that perspective, I'm not sure there is a plan which is being threatened here. There are plans that could be threatened, but I'm not sure there is a singular plan. And so it's always a question of which way the powers that shouldn't be, the various interlocking forces, which way they want to try to direct change, because change is always happening and it's always moving forward. It's just a question of which direction do we go in with this or that change. So there is a sense in which these populist movements and things absolutely can be co-opted and diverted and put into part of the larger plan. So we always have to think, I think, from that strategic framework where, yeah, there's a lot of things that are happening that maybe if there was some magic controller who controlled literally every event in the world wouldn't want to happen. But if it's happening, well, how can we direct it this way, or how can we direct it that way? I think that's the way that the people, for example, attending Bilderberg, tend to think of world events, is how can we use this momentum to our advantage? And that, conversely, that's exactly how we, the people who aren't in those positions of power with billions of dollars and banks and whatever at our control, that's the way we need to be thinking about this. Change is happening. We are in a forward momentum, but how do we direct that, and how do we make it so it doesn't end up in this consolidation of control in the hands of this power-mad elite?
But as we see the change, as we see the wealth of these, for lack of a better term right now, the elite, doesn't that give them some sort of an extra thumb over us? I mean, doesn't that allow them to truly control things more so than they ever have before? Yes,
absolutely. It's kind of the snowball rolling downhill. I mean, it's not just that they're rich and powerful. It's that discrepancy between their riches and power is growing and growing and growing. So that, absolutely, people in those positions do have vastly more resources to throw at these things than the people. But I mean, there are a couple of things to note about that. And one of them is that I always try to bring it back to the perspective that, yes, absolutely, they spend unthinkable amounts of money and time and energy trying to direct society this way and that, and to brainwash people, and to keep them in their bubbles, and to keep them fighting with each other, divide and conquer, and all of these things. But I think what that actually points to, in a way that sometimes gets glossed over, is the fact that it still is the average people out there. It's really us and our opinions and which way we are motivated to go that is still the underlying determining factor. That's why they spend so much time propagandizing and trying to make us believe that or this, or to throw us off, or to stage a deep state event in order to make everyone panic. It's because our reactions still are the important piece of this puzzle. There are billions of us, and only, however many it is, if you want to count the super-gophers, if you take, David Rothkopf's formulation, he called them the superclass, and he said there is about 8,000 people on the planet who have the ability to influence international events that are supranational. And if you want to take that formulation, then there are 8,000 of them. There are billions of us. We really do have the power, but we have to consciously know and wield that power. And that's exactly why I'm here. And I'm imagining it's a large part of the reason that you're there doing what you do.
Yes, absolutely. It was interesting. I saw a short interview right before the show. It was Robert Kennedy Jr. was being interviewed by, I don't know, one of the Fox analysts. I think it was Tucker Carlson, and I just saw the end of it. Is releasing a new book, and but he was upset about the president not releasing more information on the assassination of his uncle. And it was really it piqued my interest because he's talking about what he had seen and about how the CIA was connected to the assassination and so forth. And he really had some great information, and that really doesn't even, match up to what we were talking about, except, here's this other little group that the history was changed, and it's difficult to truly get to the truth to the matter. So I will get the title of that book. I couldn't didn't have a chance to see what the title of the book was, but it was really an interesting interview with Robert Kennedy Jr.
Yeah, I don't know the book off the top of my head either, but I do know that, yes, RFK Jr. has been talking a lot more openly about some of these things recently, including not just the assassination of his uncle, but also his father. And again, I don't know how much this has been openly questioned by the family itself, but at any rate, it is now being openly brought into the question: who killed RFK? Was it Sirhan, or is that a patsy? And anyone who's actually looked into the matter know that there is ample evidence that RFK was not assassinated by Sirhan, that he was hit by multiple bullets, including some from close range at the back, where Sirhan was not standing. So there are, just as there are questions about, well, not just questions, but really impossibilities with regards to the official account of the JFK assassination, it's also there with the RFK assassination.
What do you think would happen if the truth ever came out?
It's a very good question, because we're now over half a century out, and certainly I would imagine most of the main players in whatever assassination plots existed are now long gone, and many of the people who were in the thick of it are, at the very least, extremely advancing in age. And so I think there is a point at which these types of things could ultimately come out in one way or another and not completely upend society. And that's actually kind of a horrible thought, because anyone who studies history knows there are always conspiracies and plots and power plays and intrigues and all sorts of things going on, and we understand this and we know this from all eras of history going back thousands of years, and we know about the assassination of Caesar and things like this. It's happened over and over and over again in history. But for some reason, no, that doesn't happen in our era. Oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Oh, you must be crazy. So there's some line, there's like almost a statute of limitations, but not in a legal sense, in a psychological sense, for people to accept, oh yeah, that happened, but that was in the past and that doesn't affect us now. And I don't know if we're crossing over that line with JFK, but we must be getting close to it.
Well, I hope they do it soon. As I'm still here, I would like to see what happens. But anyway, something interesting. I saw the report tonight that your prime minister is scheduled to meet with President Trump tomorrow. This trip was hastily arranged. And so the trip sort of suggests that the Japanese leaders might have some concerns about this administration's, the United States administration, Trump's administration, to the approach to North Korea, as well as trade and, of course, the U.S. and China relations. There's concerns that, that Japan might be just totally eliminated with these agreements. So they're concerned about the nuclear part of it. And there's a growing fear of decoupling, concerns that the United States might not uphold its extended commitments to Japan and South Korea. Are these true concerns for Japan?
There are, I think, a couple of main issues on the table here, and as you say, I think the steel tariffs and the other things that are starting the protectionist trade wars are very much front and center in terms of Abe's maybe interest in getting Trump's ear into finding out, in deeper detail where this is going. But I think, as you say, obviously the North Korean summit is going to be an incredibly important part of any conversation that takes place. And one of the issues that I find interesting is that, in fact, it's not actually clear how much access Japan is going to have to the real inside information about what is actually happening at the summit, to the point where it is now being reported that Japan is sending representatives to Singapore to hopefully get some updates while they're there about what is happening. It may be the case where the Japanese government is actually getting updates about the conference the same way we all are from the news.
Well, let's hold those thoughts. We're heading into a break, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Melody Cedarstrom, and I'm here with James Corbett, and we'll be right back right after these few short messages. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Again, you're listening to Financial Survival. I'm Melody Cedarstrom, and I'm here with my co-host, or my guest, I should say, my guest, James Corbett, of an editorial writer of the International Forecaster and the Corbett Report. I'm so sorry, James.
CorbettReport.com or thecorbettreport.com.
Thank you very much. And again, my apologies. But so, folks, make sure you get there. I love visiting your website. There's so much great information, and it's a website that makes you think. And I prefer reading over videos, and you have a lot to read there. So that's why I'm fond of your website. So, yes, we were talking about the North Korea summit and how Japan might feel a little abandoned because them not being welcomed, perhaps.
Well, the entire summit is just so seems cobbled together in so many ways that I don't think many people, maybe not even the U.S. and North Korea, have any real clear understanding of how this is going to take place and what's going to happen and how people are going to find out about what's happening. So, as I said before the break, Abe or the I can't remember which minister, the chief cabinet secretary of Japan, Yoshihide Suga, is going to dispatch diplomats to Singapore to try to get the latest updates. So it's a pretty interesting development, the way this is all going together, and who knows what information is going to come out when. But I think Japan primarily has 2 points that are going to be extremely important. One is that in an earlier summit between Trump and Abe a couple of months ago, they had some sort of commitment, or it expressed some sort of commitment to the idea that sanctions against North Korea will not be lifted unless and until there is clear steps towards denuclearization, and that has to be, the first part of this. North Korea has to really take some significant steps towards that before the tensions are let up or whatever. So that was Japan's position. It's not so clear that is the U.S. position anymore. Perhaps the summit is more about the summit than it is about denuclearization at this point. But the other issue, which is one that I'm imagining is not even on the radar for most Americans, is the abductee issue, which is in the late 70s, early 80s, there were 17 Japanese citizens that were abducted from Japan, usually from coastal areas, literally jumped, taken, put into a boat, and taken over to North Korea, where some of them were apparently used as Japanese teachers to teach Korean spies how to speak Japanese, and others were just abducted for their identity, so were presumed killed right away. At any rate, those 17 citizens, that's been a big sticking point in any sort of possibility of relations between Japan and North Korea for many, many decades now, and it's still an issue that's raised here quite regularly in the press and amongst the public. So Abe has asked Trump to address this issue at the summit. There's also South Korean citizens that have been abducted, so this is kind of a multilateral concern, but it's not at all clear that I think this is a pressing concern on the Trump side, so I'm not sure that will be addressed.
Do you think Dennis Rodman is going to be a factor?
I suppose he could be. I mean, this is not something I ever expected to discuss, getting into geopolitics and things. But yeah, it may be that Dennis Rodman might actually be a factor in this. I mean, I don't know. I think I'm just going to break out the popcorn, essentially, for this summit, because who knows if it's going to happen, what's going to happen, how we're going to find out about what happened. I think it's just a show at this point.
Yes. Who knows? Dennis Rodman might win the Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know. Who knows? Well, this weekend we had the G7 meeting going on in Canada, and there's also an anti-G7 getting underway in China, and that is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. No Westerners are allowed in this club. And the dominant members are, of course, Russia and China. There's, I believe you mentioned there was up to 8 members currently in this anti-G7 group. But would you like to comment on both the G7 meeting in Canada and this Shanghai Cooperation Organization?
Yes. Well, the latter one first, for people who have never heard of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it officially formed in 2001 out of the Shanghai Five that was meeting from 1996. And as you say, China and Russia are the kind of the nucleus of that. But it now includes Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and just last year, India and Pakistan. India
Yes.
and Pakistan were added as members together, which is interesting because obviously India and Pakistan have their issues, but here they are together in this Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which I've always heard framed as maybe like a counter NATO type of organization. It's not explicitly a military compact like NATO, but it involves military cooperation exercises and things along those lines. So it is again interesting that India and Pakistan are together as full-fledged members in this group right now. But it also, of course, covers not just geopolitical but economic concerns and economic ties. So it's often been compared kind of loosely to some sort of counter NATO, maybe as a counter G7. Maybe that's an even better way of framing it, because it is more about, I think, about economic ties and things like that. But always some interesting things that come out of those BRICS, sorry, not the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meetings. And I did write about last year's summit in the Forecaster last year. So I will be writing about this and the G7 and Bilderberg and the North Korean summit in the Forecaster this weekend. So I hope people will stay tuned for that. Oh, and as to address the G7, it's interesting that was it a year ago, a couple of years ago, when Russia was still in the G8 at that time. Putin was very much sidelined, eating by himself and things like this, very much castigated and thrown out from the group before he was officially thrown out from the group. Now there are people speculating, well, could it be a G6 plus one, as in Trump being castigated because of the recent brouhaha around trade and the tariffs and all of this, which is causing real problems, I think, with some of these relationships. I mean, obviously, we've seen Trudeau fire back and say that Canada is going to slap on dollar-for-dollar sanctions against U.S. goods in response for the sanctioning of aluminum and other products from Canada, and Europe is getting quite angry about some of these things and taking the U.S. to the World Trade Organization to sue them. And obviously Japan has its issues with some of these protectionist policies. So there's a lot of friction. It's going to be, I think, maybe a bit more sparky kind of G7 than we're used to, when usually they're about putting on at least a cooperative front for the cameras. It may not be that way this year.
Well, isn't the WTO basically worthless? I mean, I've seen lawsuits go through before, nothing really happens, and this and that happens, but it's really nothing. I mean, they have allowed China, to abuse.
It's very true. I mean, the worst thing that could possibly happen is if the World Trade Organization actually grew real teeth and really did become a major player, because I think that would be, globalization arriving in the worst possible form. And I've talked about, I've written in the Forecaster before about some of the ways that there are some pretty disturbing trends towards companies, for example, being able to sue governments if they are seen to be harming their profit or profitability and things like this, that can really open up some horrible loopholes that most people wouldn't want, but obviously the corporations do want. So obviously, if there is a corporatocracy, they very much want the WTO to have more teeth and to be more able to step in and dictate to countries what they can and cannot do. And so obviously, I think from that perspective, we do not want the World Trade Organization to become effective. It would be like the UN becoming effective. That would actually be scary, more scary than the fact that it is a toothless monster. So at any rate, I think that's the way that it's treated. But it does, there are decisions that come down, there are punitive measures that happen, and at any rate, at the very last resort, it could kick off a trade war. And that's what the WTO is theoretically supposed to design to prevent, in the same way, I guess, the League of Nations was designed to prevent World War. Oops, it really could eventuate from this type of move.
Well, wasn't that what the Trans-Pacific Partnership was? I mean, one of the dangerous parts of that was the legalities, the being able to sue one another in a global court and so forth. I mean, that's probably not as, I'm not saying it as deep as it should be, but to me, that was the biggest problem with that.
There were very scary clauses in that TPP when it eventually got leaked out to the public. And I did write about that in the Forecaster at the time, talking about some of those clauses and what they really mean in real speak, not the legalese gobbledygook that they try to hide everything in. And there were some very scary ones, including some, as you say, some of those things about corporations being able to sue governments. So it's a good thing that the TPP was scrapped, at least in the form that it was being planned. However, it might go forward in the future without the U.S. And similarly, I think the World Trade Organization raises a lot of the same sort of issues.
I just want to go back briefly to the G7 and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. With us, if there's issues with trade with the G7, and you're seeing this, the CSO, and these countries, do you think are they going to, is this a way for them to accelerate their plans to settle trade with each other in other currencies, bypassing the dollar? And what type of impact is that going to have? The more these other groups become bigger and stronger?
Absolutely, yes. I've been writing about this for years now, and I've been trying to hammer it home recently because it's accelerating now that it seems every action that's being taken on the international stage right now by the U.S. and its Pax Americana allies is... It almost seems like it is designed to create, if not to incentivize, the creation of these counter institutions and counter frameworks and regional agreements and trading relationships, and to foster those types of counter organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and others. Obviously, the more that the U.S. pushes away its allies, the more they're going to turn to each other, and the more, for example, Iran sanctions or the sanctions against Russia or trade wars against China. Of course, I mean, the absolutely 100% predictable outcome of those types of actions is these countries are going to start banding together more. And that's exactly the point of the new Silk Road and the One Belt, One Road initiative coming out of China, is to try to bring together a lot of these nations together in more tightly consolidated and with laid down actual physical infrastructure, joining them up, putting them together in regional frameworks and groupings and strengthening economic ties so that they can trade more amongst each other. And of course, we've seen all it's the 1,000 different paper cuts, if you will, that's cutting into the US dollar hegemony. Of course, none of those paper cuts is even significant on the bigger scheme of things by itself, but they start to add up, and we can imagine the balance of trade settlement starting to change, and the US dollar, which is almost universally used in international trade, is starting to get chipped away at. And China specifically is making sure that there's a lot of different ways that people can now start to use the yuan. It still is not really a currency that's very usable. There are two currencies. There's the international one and the kind of domestic one, and the domestic one is pegged in a floating peg with the US dollar. So there's a lot of things that disincentivize international trade being settled in the yuan, but they're starting to open that up. And things like the, as we talked about before, the oil futures contracts denominated in yuan, things like that are really starting to change the calculus for some of these nations. And now that Iran is being sanctioned again, what are they going to do? Well, hey, maybe they can trade with China directly in yuan for oil. And there's some significant changes that are happening. And as I say, I think this is being actively incentivized and fostered by the moves that are being made on the other side of the chessboard right now.
And, with Iran and the sanctions, isn't there discussions that some of these trades would be done with gold?
Yes, although, as you pointed out, some of the sanctions themselves are against gold settlement and gold trade with Iran. So I think that maybe they've already foreseen that. In fact, one of the largest and most elaborate sanctions evasion schemes in the history of the world took place during the last round of Iranian sanctions, where Turkey was doing the gold for gas deal with Iran. And that is still being unraveled. I think just earlier this year, it was some people were just convicted in their part in that sanctions evasion scheme in court. So it's still being unraveled, and things are still going on about that. But yes, clearly, one way or another, Certainly that oil and gas is going to find some way out towards some very hungry markets, including, of course, China, the largest oil importer in the world at this point. So it's going to happen. It's just a question of which way they facilitate that trade.
Well, what if the EU doesn't go along and bypasses the sanctions that the U.S. puts on Iran? What if they don't pull out of the agreement? What if they continue?
Yes, that's something I've been writing about recently, too. It's not at all clear that they're going to just blanket go along with this. But, of course, the U.S. is also thinking about that, so they're threatening to sanction companies that do go around the sanctions directly. So it's becoming quite a mess. And I think the G7 and others will be interesting just to see how these relations start to pan out, because obviously there are some big changes coming on the geopolitical table.
Well, we're out of time, James. We could go on for another hour. I do enjoy spending these two segments with you, and I look forward to doing it again in 2 weeks. So thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen. 1-800-375-4188. We'll be back tomorrow. I'll be back with you tomorrow. Until then, be safe, good night, and God bless.
Available now from CorbettReport.com. Oil. The 19th century was transformed by it. The 20th century was shaped by it. And the 21st century is moving beyond it. But who gave birth to the oil industry? And what are they planning to do with that power in a post-carbon world?
Heirs to an oil fortune join the divestment drive.
There is a price to carbon in their future.
The negative impact of population growth.
That is important not only for the planet, it is important for the business.
What do you see as the biggest challenges in conservation?
The growing human population.
How and why big oil conquered the world. Watch the documentary for free or purchase a DVD copy at CorbettReport.com/bigoil.